She saved a mountain man's son from fire, and what he suggested as payment stunned her. The wind howls through the Colorado peaks as flames devour a lonely log cabin. A woman with burn-scarred arms charges into the blaze, dragging a coughing boy to safety. The father drops to his knees in the snow, his home gone, his heart pounding with thanks, and something else he can't yet name. But when he offers her payment, he doesn't reach for silver or gold. He asks her to stay, to help raise the boy she saved, under his roof, through the long mountain winter. Whispers start in town, calling her cursed, fire-touched, dangerous. A stranger rides in from her past, claiming she caused another blaze that killed her own kin. Now the truth behind those scars could destroy everything she's begun to rebuild. Is his offer a gift from God, or the beginning of her second burning? And when the next storm comes, will love be enough to survive the fire again? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter wind howled through the Colorado ridges, its icy fingers clawing at Matthew Hart's wool coat as he guided his horse along the narrow mountain trail. February of 1878 had brought more snow than usual, making his daily checks of the trap lines longer and more treacherous. His leather saddle creaked with each step as his mount carefully picked its way through the fresh powder. Matthew pulled his collar higher against the biting cold, his thoughts turning to his son Caleb back at their cabin. The boy was old enough now to tend the home fire, while Matthew worked the trap lines, though leaving him alone never sat easy in Matthew's heart. But winter was unforgiving, and they needed the pelts to trade for supplies come spring. The gelding's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as Matthew rounded the last bend before home. His eyes narrowed as he spotted something unusual against the darkening sky. A thin curl of smoke rising above the trees, too much smoke for their usual cooking fire. His heart lurched in his chest. "Hiya!" Matthew dug his heels into the horse's flanks, urging him faster through the deepening drifts. The gelding responded instantly, powerful muscles bunching as it broke into a gallop. Snow flew from its hooves as they raced toward home, Matthew's breath coming in sharp bursts that frosted in the frigid air. As they crested the final rise, Matthew's worst fears materialized before him. Angry orange flames were already consuming the cabin's thatched roof, throwing wild shadows across the snow. Sparks swirled up into the night sky like a swarm of deadly fireflies. "Caleb!" The name tore from Matthew's throat as he spurred his horse down the slope. "Caleb!" The heat hit him like a wall as he reached the cabin yard. He threw himself from the saddle before his mount had fully stopped, stumbling in his haste to reach the burning building. The flames roared louder than the wind now, consuming everything they touched with terrible hunger. Just as Matthew reached for the door, it burst open. A figure emerged from the inferno, someone he'd never seen before, cloaked in dark wool and moving with desperate purpose. In their arms was Caleb, coughing and soot-stained but alive. Matthew's knees nearly buckled with relief. The stranger, a woman, he realized, half carried, half dragged his son well away from the burning cabin. Caleb's face was streaked with tears and ash, but his eyes were open and alert as he gasped in the clean night air. Matthew's instincts warred between rushing to his son and trying to save what he could of their home. He sprinted to the well, hauling up the water bucket with strength born of desperation. But even as he threw the first bucketful at the flames, he knew it was futile. The fire had too strong a hold, greedily devouring the dry winter wood. A thunderous crack split the air as the main beam gave way. Matthew stumbled backward as the roof caved in, sending a geyser of sparks skyward. The heat was unbearable now, forcing him to retreat to where the woman held Caleb. Together they watched helplessly as the flames consumed everything. Their shelter, their winter stores, all their worldly possessions reduced to ash and embers. When the worst of the heat had subsided, Matthew knelt beside them in the snow. His son was trembling, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. The woman's breath came in ragged gasps, and Matthew noticed with alarm that both her sleeves were badly singed, angry red burns visible beneath the charred fabric. "You saved my boy," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. The words seemed wholly inadequate for what she'd done, but they were all he could manage past the tightness in his throat. She turned to face him fully then, and Matthew saw that she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps in her early 30s, with intelligent eyes set in a face that spoke of both gentleness and determination. Despite her obvious pain, she kept a protective arm around Caleb's shoulders. "I was passing on the lower trail," she explained between labored breaths. "Saw the smoke and knew something was wrong." A wet cough racked her frame, and she winced. "Name's Nora Thorne." "Matthew Hart," he responded automatically, then gathered Caleb into his arms, holding him close as the boy began to sob. "And this is my son, Caleb. I can't thank you enough, Miss Thorne. If you hadn't been there—" He couldn't finish the thought. The possibility was too horrifying to voice. Caleb clung to his father's coat, words tumbling out between tears. "I'm sorry, Pa. I was just trying to keep the fire going like you showed me. But the wind, and then the sparks—" His small frame shook with guilt and fear. "Hush now," Matthew soothed, though his own heart ached at the terror his son must have felt. "You're safe. That's all that matters." The wind picked up again, cutting through their wet clothes with icy precision. Miss Thorne swayed slightly, and Matthew noticed how pale she'd become beneath the soot stains on her face. The burns on her arms needed tending, and they all needed shelter from the bitter night. "We need to get out of this cold," he said, rising with Caleb still in his arms. "My horse can carry all three of us to the Miller place. It's the nearest shelter about 4 miles south." He turned to Miss Thorne, concern etching his features. "Can you ride?" She nodded, though the movement seemed to cost her. "I've endured worse," she said simply, but Matthew saw how she cradled her injured arms against her body. He helped her mount first, then lifted Caleb up in front of her before swinging into the saddle himself. The gelding shifted under the unusual weight, but stayed steady, sensing perhaps the gravity of their situation. As Matthew guided them away from the smoldering ruins of their home, he felt Caleb's small hand grip his arm. "What'll we do now, Pa?" Matthew watched the last flames flicker against the star-filled sky, trying to find words of comfort when his own heart was heavy with loss. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd built since Sarah's passing 3 years ago, gone in a single night. But his son was alive, saved by this stranger's courage, and that was worth more than any possession. "We'll rebuild," he said firmly, though he had no idea how they'd manage it. "The good Lord provides, son, sometimes in ways we don't expect." He glanced back at Miss Thorne, who met his gaze with quiet understanding despite her obvious pain. "Sometimes he sends angels in disguise." The wind continued its mournful song through the ridges as they made their slow way through the darkness. Behind them, the last embers of their old life glowed like dying stars against the snow. But with each plodding step of the horse, Matthew felt something else growing alongside his grief. A spark of hope, small but steady as a heartbeat, telling him that perhaps this night of loss might also be the beginning of something new. From her position behind him, Miss Thorne began humming softly, an old hymn about grace and shelter in times of storm. Caleb's trembling gradually stilled as the familiar melody wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Matthew found himself listening intently, letting the simple tune remind him that even in the darkest moments, light could still be found. As they picked their way carefully down the snowy trail, Matthew's mind raced with immediate concerns: shelter for the night, treatment for Miss Thorne's burns, plans for surviving what remained of winter with nothing but what they carried. But beneath these practical worries ran a deeper current of wonder at how quickly life could change, how a stranger's selfless act could alter everything in the space of a few heartbeats. The horse's steady breathing and the crunch of snow beneath its hooves created a rhythm that seemed to say, "Survive, endure, begin again." Matthew tightened his grip on the reins, drew strength from the warm weight of his son against his chest, and faced forward into the unknown night. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together, father, son, and the mysterious woman who had braved the flames to save a child she'd never met. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas playing out beneath their cold light. But in the darkness between those distant points of light, Matthew thought he could feel the presence of something larger than himself, something that had guided Miss Thorne to their cabin at exactly the right moment, something that whispered of purpose even in loss. He clicked softly to the horse, urging it carefully around a patch of ice. The Miller place wasn't far now. Soon they would have warmth, shelter, and help for Miss Thorne's injuries. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, Matthew focused on the miracle of his son's survival and the mysterious grace that had delivered it through a stranger's hands. The eastern sky brightened reluctantly, as if the sun itself hesitated to reveal the destruction wrought by night. Matthew Hart stood among the smoking ruins of his cabin, watching pale fingers of dawn stretch across the snow-dusted ground. The bitter wind had died down, leaving behind an eerie stillness broken only by the occasional pop of cooling embers. His muscles ached from the sleepless night, but there was work to be done. Caleb huddled near Miss Thorne, who sat propped against a fallen log, her burned arms held carefully away from her body. The sight of their breath clouding in the frigid air spurred Matthew to action. "First things shelter," he muttered, more to himself than his companions. Moving methodically through the wreckage, he began identifying timbers that might still serve. Some of the logs from the rear wall had escaped the worst of the fire, their ends charred but their length still sound. Matthew dragged these away from the ashes, one by one, his boots crunching through the thin crust of ice that had formed overnight. "Can I help, Pa?" Caleb's voice was small but eager, desperate perhaps to make amends for what he saw as his fault. Matthew paused in his work, meeting his son's eyes. "Reckon you can, boy. Look for any nails that ain't too bent. We'll need every one we can find." As Caleb picked carefully through the cooler edges of the ruins, Matthew set about constructing a lean-to against a sturdy pine that had survived the blaze. He worked with the efficiency of long practice, setting the salvaged timbers at an angle against the trunk and securing them with strips torn from his spare shirt. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep off the worst of the weather until they could manage better. Miss Thorne watched their efforts with evident concern, trying to rise despite her injuries. "Please, let me do something," she insisted, wincing as the movement pulled at her burns. "You've done plenty already," Matthew replied firmly. "Those burns need tending before anything else." He paused in his work, studying her pale face. "You said you were a healer?" She nodded, settling back against the log with a grimace. "I carry medicines, but—" She glanced toward the ruins, and Matthew understood. Her supplies had been in the saddlebags she'd dropped when rushing to save Caleb. Matthew strode to his horse, still tethered where they'd left it the night before. From his own saddlebags, he retrieved a small tin of salve, a simple mixture of bear grease and herbs his wife had taught him to make. The memory of Sarah's patient instructions tightened his throat as he knelt beside Miss Thorne. "It ain't much," he said gruffly, "but it's better than nothing." She started to protest, but he was already gathering clean snow in his hands, letting it melt against his skin. With gentle movements that belied his weathered appearance, he began cleaning the burns that marked her forearms like angry red ribbons. "Your boy," she said softly, perhaps to distract herself from the pain. "He's got a good heart. He was trying to keep the fire just right when I found him, worried you'd be cold coming home." Matthew's hands stilled for a moment. "That's Caleb, all right. Always thinking of others, just like his mama was." He resumed his careful ministrations, applying the salve with feather-light touches. "We lost her 3 years back. Fever took her before the doctor could make it up the mountain." "I'm sorry," Miss Thorne whispered, and there was such genuine understanding in her voice that Matthew had to look away. Caleb returned then, clutching a handful of salvaged nails. "Found these, Pa, and look." He pulled something from his pocket, a dented tin cup, its handle slightly warped but still intact. "Can we make coffee?" Matthew managed to smile. "Good thinking, son. There's some grounds in my saddlebag. Why don't you fetch them?" While Caleb busied himself with this task, Matthew finished binding Miss Thorne's arms with strips from his cleanest kerchief. She thanked him with a nod, her eyes bright with unshed tears. From pain or something else, he couldn't tell. Soon, the bitter aroma of coffee drifted through the crisp morning air. They passed the single cup between them, each taking careful sips of the weak brew. It was a poor excuse for breakfast, but the warmth was welcome. Standing slowly, Matthew surveyed what remained of his home. 10 years of labor reduced to ashes and char. The words came unbidden to his lips, half remembered from Sarah's worn Bible. "The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." "Job," Miss Thorne said quietly, "a man who lost everything but kept his faith." Matthew glanced at her sharply, but there was no judgment in her face, only compassion, and something that might have been admiration. With the lean-to secured, and the coffee gone, Matthew began the grim task of salvaging what he could from the ruins. His rifle had survived, protected by its oiled wrappings where it had hung by the door. A few of his winter pelts, stored in a chest, were smoke-damaged but usable. And there, beneath a fallen beam, he found Sarah's Bible, its edges scorched but its pages mostly intact. Miss Thorne had insisted on helping despite her injuries, pointing out items he might have missed. A pot here, a handful of tools there. Caleb trailed behind them, clutching each recovered treasure as if it were pure gold. The sun was setting by the time they finished, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and amber. Matthew had laid his cot, another salvaged item, beneath the lean-to, its frame slightly warped but still serviceable. "You'll take the cot," he told Miss Thorne, his tone brooking no argument. "Caleb and I will manage fine by the fire." She shook her head, stubborn despite her evident exhaustion. "I can't take your bed, Mr. Hart. You've already done too much." Matthew caught her gaze and held it. "You earned more than rest, Miss Thorne. My boy's alive because of you. The cot's yours for as long as you need it." Something passed between them then, an understanding deeper than words. She ducked her head in acceptance, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you." As night drew its dark curtain across the sky, Matthew built up the fire with wood Caleb had gathered from the surrounding forest. He and his son huddled together beneath their single blanket, watching the flames dance and listening to the soft sounds of Miss Thorne's breathing from the cot. Caleb snuggled closer, his small body gradually relaxing as sleep approached. "Pa?" he whispered. Yes, son? I'm sorry about the cabin. Matthew tightened his arm around his boy's shoulders. Nothing to be sorry for. We're all alive. That's what matters. Everything else can be rebuilt. Miss Thorne. Caleb yawned hugely. She's like an angel, ain't she? Coming out of nowhere like that? Matthew looked over at the sleeping woman, her face peaceful despite the pain she must still feel. Maybe she is, son. Maybe she is. The stars wheeled overhead, brilliant in the crystal-clear mountain air. Matthew found himself offering up a prayer of gratitude, not for what was lost, but for what remained. His son's steady breathing, the warmth of the fire, and the mysterious presence of a woman who had risked her life for strangers. Grief still sat heavy in his chest, but alongside it now was something else, a profound thankfulness that made the weight easier to bear. As he drifted toward sleep, Matthew realized that even in the ashes of disaster, grace could take root and grow. The night deepened around their small camp, and the fire burned low. But in the darkness, 3 hearts beat in quiet harmony, survivors of flame and fear, bound together by providence and courage, finding rest at last beneath the vast Colorado sky. The morning dawned bitter cold, frost crystallizing on every surface like nature's own lacework. Matthew Hart woke before the sun, his muscles stiff from sleeping on the frozen ground. Beside him, Caleb still slumbered, wrapped tightly in their shared blanket. On the cot, Miss Thorne stirred, her breath making small clouds in the frigid air. Matthew carefully extracted himself from the blanket, tucking it more securely around his son. The fire had burned down to embers during the night, and he set about coaxing it back to life, adding small twigs and then larger branches until warmth began to seep back into their makeshift camp. The sound of movement caught his attention. Miss Thorne was sitting up, wincing as she examined her bandaged arms in the weak morning light. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins during the night, falling in waves around her shoulders. "How are the burns?" Matthew asked quietly, not wanting to wake Caleb. "Better than they might have been, thanks to your care." She offered a small smile. "I should clean them properly, though. Is there a stream nearby?" Matthew nodded. "Just beyond those pines. I'll show you the way." She rose carefully, gathering her skirts around her. Despite her injuries, there was a grace to her movements that spoke of someone used to working through pain. Matthew grabbed a clean cloth from his saddlebag and led the way through the trees. The stream burbled beneath a thin sheet of ice near the banks, but the center still ran free and clear. Matthew broke through the ice with a stick, creating a space where Miss Thorne could reach the water. He turned his back to give her privacy, focusing instead on checking the area for any signs of predators that might have come investigating during the night. The splash of water and a sharp intake of breath made him glance back involuntarily. Miss Thorne had removed her outer jacket to better access her wounds, and in that moment, Matthew caught sight of something that made his heart clench. Old scars, silvery in the morning light, tracing patterns across her shoulders and upper arms where her chemise had slipped. She must have felt his gaze, because she quickly pulled her shawl up, but not before their eyes met. There was no shame in her expression, only a deep, abiding sorrow that seemed to echo his own losses. "I reckon we all carry our scars," Matthew said softly, giving her the opening to speak or stay silent as she chose. For a long moment, only the sound of the running water filled the space between them. Then, her voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. "It was 5 years ago, near Kansas City." Her hands continued their careful cleaning of her fresh burns, but her mind was clearly far away. "My husband James and I had a small farm. Nothing grand, but it was ours. and we had just been blessed with a beautiful baby boy. She paused, gathering strength before continuing. One night, I was up late with the baby. He was colicky, wouldn't settle. I must have dozed off while nursing him. When I woke, the lamp had tipped over, and the whole room was in flames. Matthew stood perfectly still, hearing not just the words, but the weight of grief behind them. "James," her voice caught. "He got us out, but then he went back in for the family Bible, my grandmother's, with all our history written inside. The roof collapsed before he could reach the door." She drew a shuddering breath. The baby. The smoke was too much for his tiny lungs. He died in my arms before dawn. The confession hung in the frosty air between them. Matthew found himself moving closer, drawn by the raw pain in her voice. "Since then, I've wandered," she continued, her hands now still in her lap. "Learning healing arts, helping where I can, hoping to mend what I once destroyed." A bitter smile touched her lips, as if saving others could somehow balance the scales. "You saved my boy," Matthew said quietly. "That's no small thing." She looked up at him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Perhaps that's why God led me here, though I don't pretend to understand his ways anymore." Matthew understood that feeling all too well. He'd wrestled with similar doubts after Sarah's death, angry at a God who would let a good woman die while he was miles away on his trapline, unable to help. "Let me pay you," he said suddenly, "for saving Caleb, for your injuries." But she was already shaking her head. "No, I don't want money, Mr. Hart. What I did—" She squared her shoulders, wincing slightly. "What I did because no child should die in flames while adults stand helpless." Matthew studied her face, seeing beyond the scars to the strength that had carried her through her own personal hell. An idea began to form in his mind, crazy perhaps, but feeling more right with each passing moment. "Then stay," he said simply. She blinked, clearly startled. "What?" "Stay here." The words came faster now, with growing conviction. "Help me rebuild. Teach my boy kindness again. He's been too long with just his gruff old pa for company. And maybe—" He hesitated, then pushed on. "Maybe find some peace for yourself in the process." Nora Thorne stared at him, her expression a complex mixture of yearning and fear. "Mr. Hart, Matthew," he corrected gently. "If you're staying, it ought to be Matthew." "If I'm staying?" She shook her head, but there was a tremulous smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I haven't agreed to anything yet." As if nature herself wanted to weigh in on the decision, soft flakes of snow began to drift down through the pine boughs above them. They watched in silence as the white specks grew thicker, beginning to dust their shoulders and hair. "Storm's coming," Matthew observed. "Likely to be a big one this time of year. Wouldn't be right to send you out in it, especially injured as you are." She laughed then, a sound that seemed to surprise them both. "Are you trying to manipulate me with weather, Mr. Hart, Matthew?" He allowed himself a small smile. "Is it working?" The snow continued to fall, gathering momentum. Nora looked up at the gray sky, then back at the man standing before her. Something shifted in her expression. A letting go, perhaps, or a taking hold of something new. "Through winter," she said finally. "I'll stay through winter at least, to help with Caleb, and with the rebuilding." Matthew nodded, relief and something warmer flooding through him. "That's all I'm asking. For now." They made their way back to camp, where Caleb was just stirring from his blanket nest. The boy's face lit up when he saw Nora, and Matthew watched as she smiled back, some of the sadness in her eyes lifting as she greeted him. The snow fell steadily now, adding another layer of white to the world around them, But as Matthew stoked the fire and began planning what they would need to survive the winter and rebuild come spring, he felt a sense of rightness settle over him. Here, among the ashes of what was lost, something new was taking root, fragile as a snowflake, but just as perfect in its design. Their small family of 3 gathered close to the fire, sharing what remained of yesterday's coffee. None of them spoke of what had passed between Matthew and Nora at the stream, but something had changed. The air felt lighter somehow, despite the heavy snow, as if hope itself had taken up residence in their humble camp. The morning sun painted long shadows across fresh-fallen snow as Matthew's axe bit deep into pine wood. Each strike echoed through the crisp mountain air, a steady rhythm that spoke of determination and renewal. They had chosen a spot further up the slope, where the ground leveled into a small clearing. Here, the winter wind would be less harsh, and spring would bring wild strawberries in the meadow beyond. Nora worked nearby, her burned arms healing enough now to grip the crosscut saw. She drew it back and forth through smaller logs, creating neat sections for the cabin walls. Her movements were precise and purposeful, though she occasionally paused to flex her tender hands. "Miss Nora," Caleb called out, trotting up with his arms full of rusty nails salvaged from the old cabin's remains. "I found more in the ashes, just like Pa said I might." Nora smiled warmly at the boy, setting down her saw. "Well done, Caleb. Those will save us precious time." She brushed snow from a nearby stump and patted it. "Come rest a moment. You've been running back and forth all morning." Matthew watched from the corner of his eye as his son settled beside Nora. The boy had stayed close to her ever since the fire, as if afraid she might disappear like smoke into the winter sky. Something in Matthew's chest tightened at the sight of them together, Nora showing Caleb how to sort the nails by size, her patient voice carrying on the clean mountain air. "Reckon we've got enough logs cut for the north wall," Matthew said, driving his axe into a stump and wiping his brow. "Might be time to start raising the frame." Together they worked through the short winter day. Matthew notched the logs while Nora helped guide them into place. Even Caleb pitched in, gathering smaller branches for kindling and helping to pack moss between the logs for insulation. The work was hard, but it carried a sense of purpose that warmed them better than any fire. As dusk approached, Nora stirred a pot of rabbit stew hanging over their temporary hearth. The aroma of wild onions and herbs filled their makeshift shelter, making Matthew's stomach rumble. He watched as she added the last of their dried carrots, her movements careful and precise. "Smells mighty fine," he offered, earning one of her shy smiles in return. "It's not much," she replied, "but it'll keep our strength up for tomorrow's work." They gathered close around the fire, passing their only 2 bowls between them. Caleb sat between them, his small face glowing in the firelight. Matthew found himself studying the boy, noting how the constant wariness in his eyes had begun to soften these past days. After the meal, as Nora cleared away the bowls, Matthew felt something stir inside him, a yearning he hadn't acknowledged in years. Before he could second-guess himself, he cleared his throat. "Might be time for evening prayers," he said roughly, the words feeling strange on his tongue. He hadn't led prayers since Sarah passed, leaving that piece of their life buried with her. Nora and Caleb both looked at him with surprise, but neither spoke. Taking their silence as encouragement, Matthew closed his eyes and began. "Lord," he started, voice uncertain, "we thank you for this day's work and this food." He paused, struggling to find the right words. For bringing Miss Thorne to us when we needed her most, for sparing my boy." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. "And for giving us strength to begin again," Nora added softly, her hand finding Caleb's shoulder. "Amen," Caleb whispered, and Matthew felt tears prick behind his closed eyes. The next morning brought Nora sitting with Caleb, a charred page from their rescued Bible spread carefully on a flat piece of bark between them. She traced the letters with a stick in the dirt, teaching him their shapes and sounds. "See here?" She pointed to a word. "This says light. Can you sound it out?" Caleb leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. Light, he managed, looking up at her for confirmation. "That's exactly right," Nora beamed, and Matthew saw his son's face light up with pride. The lesson was interrupted by dark clouds rolling in from the west, bringing with them a bitter wind that cut through their clothes. Matthew eyed the sky with concern. "Storm's coming," he announced. "A big one, by the look of those clouds." They worked faster then, racing to secure what they could before the weather hit. Just as they finished nailing the last roof boards in place, the first snowflakes began to fall. Within hours, the storm had transformed into a howling beast that threatened to tear away their newly built walls. For 3 days, the blizzard raged outside their small cabin. The wind found every crack and crevice, but the walls held firm. They huddled close to the hearth, conserving warmth and sharing stories. Nora produced the salvaged Bible, its pages wavy from smoke and water, but still readable. "Shall we?" she asked, opening to the Psalms. Matthew nodded, and she began to read by firelight. "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." Her voice carried clear and strong above the storm's fury. "Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea." Caleb listened intently, his head resting against Matthew's shoulder. The words seemed to fill their small space with something larger than themselves, hope, perhaps, or the promise of deliverance. Matthew found himself remembering how Sarah used to read these same verses, and for the first time, the memory brought more comfort than pain. They passed the long hours reading, talking in low voices, and sharing what remained of their supplies. Nora taught Caleb to play fox and geese with pebbles on a board, scratched in the dirt floor. His laughter, when he managed to trap her fox, rang out like music against the storm's drums. Matthew watched them play, something warm and unfamiliar expanding in his chest. He recognized it gradually as contentment, a feeling he'd thought lost forever in the ashes of his old life. When the storm finally broke on the 4th morning, sunlight poured through their single window like honey. They stepped outside to find the world transformed. 3 feet of snow blanketed everything in pristine white. The air was so clear it hurt to breathe, and the sky arched above them in impossible blue. Caleb immediately ran out to play, throwing himself backward to make snow angels. His laughter echoed off the mountainside, bright and unburdened. Nora watched him with shining eyes, and when she caught Matthew looking at her, she didn't turn away. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for asking me to stay." Matthew nodded, words failing him as usual. But as they stood together in the morning light, watching Caleb's joy paint itself across the snow, he felt something shift and settle in his heart, like the last log falling into place on a well-built wall. Back inside their cabin, the morning sun streamed through the window, catching motes of dust in its beam. The single room felt full, not with things, for they had precious little of those, but with the subtle warmth of shared purpose and growing trust. Laughter came easier now, filling the space like a promise of better days ahead. Nora busied herself with hanging dried herbs from the roof beams, while Caleb practiced his letters in the dirt floor near the hearth. Matthew worked on fitting a proper door, his hands steady and sure with the tools. The quiet sounds of their industry, The scrape of wood, the whisper of dried leaves, the soft murmur of a child sounding out words, wove together into something that felt remarkably like home. The weather finally broke after a week of relentless snow, revealing a crisp blue sky that promised easier travel. Matthew stood in the doorway of their new cabin, studying the pristine white landscape while adjusting his worn leather coat. "Reckon it's time we made that supply run," he announced, turning to where Nora stirred the morning porridge. "We're running mighty low on just about everything." Nora nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "The trading post in Silver Creek should have what we need. I passed through there before." She trailed off, her fingers unconsciously brushing the scarred skin at her wrist. "We'll all go," Matthew decided, his voice firm. "Caleb needs proper boots, and the wagon can handle the snow now." They set out just after sunrise, the old mule pulling their wagon steadily through the deep snow. Matthew had laid fresh hay in the bed to keep his passengers somewhat comfortable, though the wooden planks still made for a bumpy ride. Caleb sat between them on the bench, wrapped in every blanket they could spare. The journey to Silver Creek took most of the morning. The settlement emerged from the white landscape like a painting, a cluster of wooden buildings with smoke curling from their chimneys, nestled in a valley between towering pines. A few horses stood hitched outside the mercantile, steam rising from their flanks. "Ain't much," Matthew said apologetically as he helped Nora down from the wagon. "But Mr. Peterson keeps a fair store." The bell above the mercantile door announced their arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed at odds with the sudden hush that fell over the store. Matthew noticed how conversation stopped, replaced by meaningful glances between the customers as Nora stepped inside. The store clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, stared openly at the burn scars visible on Nora's neck and hands. She pulled her shawl closer, but kept her chin high as she approached the counter with their list. "We need flour," she said clearly, "and sugar, if you have it. Coffee, too." The clerk nodded stiffly, but his eyes darted to a woman nearby, whispering something Matthew couldn't quite catch. He moved closer to Nora, his presence solid and protective. While the clerk gathered their supplies, a well-dressed woman, wife to the biggest rancher in the valley by her fine clothes, stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Nora's scars. "You're fire-touched," she said, not quite a question, her voice carrying clearly through the store. Matthew's jaw tightened, his hand closing into a fist at his side. But Nora's voice remained steady as she counted out coins for their purchases. "Just the sugar and flour today, thank you," she said to the clerk, as if she hadn't heard the woman's words at all. Caleb pressed closer to Nora's side, his young face troubled as he watched the adults around them. Matthew could see the boys' distress, and knew they needed to get out of there soon. "Add some candy to that," Matthew told the clerk gruffly, dropping extra coins on the counter. "And we'll take that pie I see cooling in the window." The clerk hurried to wrap their purchases, eager to have them gone. As they loaded the supplies into their wagon, Matthew could see faces watching from the store windows. "There's a cafe just down the street," he said, helping Nora and Caleb back onto the wagon seat. "Might as well eat that pie somewhere warm." The cafe was nearly empty when they entered, but the few patrons there made no effort to hide their stares. They found a table near the window, and Matthew ordered coffee for himself and Nora, milk for Caleb. The pie, apple, still warm, sat between them on the rough wooden table. Nora cut it carefully into 3 pieces, her hands steady despite the whispers they could hear from the next table. "Best pie in the territory," Matthew said loudly enough for everyone to hear, taking a large bite. "Ain't that right, Caleb?" The boy nodded, managing a small smile as he ate his slice. They finished their meal in deliberate calm, though Matthew noticed how Nora's shoulders remained tense, how she kept her eyes on her plate. The ride home seemed longer, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the snow. They were well out of town when Nora finally spoke. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing beside me in there." Matthew kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his voice was firm. "I don't judge the hands that saved my boy." The mule plodded on through the snow, its steady hoofbeats marking time as they climbed back toward their mountain home. The supplies shifted in the wagon behind them, and Caleb dozed against Nora's shoulder, worn out from the day's tensions. It wasn't until they were home, the supplies stored away and supper cooking on the hearth, that Caleb asked the question that had clearly been bothering him all day. "Miss Nora," he said, sitting close to her by the fire, "can gossip burn worse than fire?" The cabin grew very quiet. Matthew stopped his work at the table, watching Nora's face in the firelight. She was silent for a long moment, her hands still on the mending in her lap. "Only if we let it," she answered finally, her voice gentle but strong. "Words only have the power we give them, Caleb. Like fire, it can warm a home or destroy it. The choice of how we use it, how we respond to it, that belongs to us." She reached out and squeezed the boy's hand. "The good Lord knows the truth of our hearts. That's what matters most." Matthew watched them from his place by the table, seeing how Caleb leaned into Nora's touch, how naturally she offered comfort to his son. The store clerk's whispers and the rancher's wife's cruel words seemed far away now, unable to reach into this space they'd created. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing warm light across the cabin's wooden walls. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, but inside their home, the air was warm with something stronger than winter's chill, the quiet certainty of belonging. Nora returned to her mending, humming softly as she worked. Caleb stayed close, watching her hands move with the needle and thread. Matthew resumed his own task, but his thoughts kept returning to the way she'd held her head high in the face of those whispers, how she'd maintained her dignity despite their cruelty. He recognized something in her strength that matched his own stubborn determination to survive, to protect what mattered. The townsfolk's judgment meant little compared to what she'd given them, not just saving Caleb from the fire, but helping them build something new from the ashes of their loss. The evening settled around them like a warm blanket, full of small domestic sounds, the crack of the fire, the soft scratch of Nora's needle, Caleb's quiet breathing as he finally dozed off beside her. Matthew looked at them both, his son, and this scarred, brave woman who'd brought light back into their lives, and felt a fierce protectiveness that had nothing to do with duty or obligation. Let the town whisper, he thought. They knew nothing of real strength, of the courage it took to reach past pain toward hope. He'd stand beside her 100 times over, proud to call her friend, to have her as part of whatever this was becoming, this fragile, precious thing that felt more like family with each passing day. The snow fell relentlessly in the days following their trip to Silver Creek, piling high against the cabin walls. Matthew stood at the window each morning, watching the drifts grow deeper, knowing his trap line would suffer. The white expanse stretched endlessly towards the tree line, broken only by the dark shapes of pines bending under their frozen burden. He tried to keep his worry from showing as he counted their stored provisions. The beans and dried venison would need careful rationing to see them through. Each morning, he scraped frost from the inside of the windows and stoked the fire higher, watching Nora and Caleb still sleeping, their breath visible in the cold air. "Might be slim pickings for a spell," he told Nora one evening as she stirred their supper of watered-down bean soup. "Traps ain't yielding much with snow this deep." Nora nodded, adding a precious pinch of salt to the pot. "We'll make do," she said softly. "The Lord provides." Her quiet faith touched something in Matthew he thought long buried. He watched as she ladled the thin soup into their bowls, making sure Caleb got the largest portion. The boy had grown stronger under her care, less haunted by the memory of fire. That night, as Matthew mended a broken snowshoe by the hearth, he heard Nora's voice from the corner where she and Caleb sat on her bed. The lamp cast warm light over them as she opened the Bible in her lap. "Shall we say our prayers?" she asked Caleb, who nodded eagerly. Matthew's hands stilled on his work as her clear voice filled the cabin. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." From his place by the door, Matthew found himself drawn to the familiar words. His late wife used to read those same verses, but hearing them now in Nora's gentle voice brought fresh meaning. He saw how Caleb leaned against her side, his eyes closed in trust as she read, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." The lamp flickered, making shadows dance on the rough-hewn walls. Matthew felt something shift in his chest, like ice breaking up on a spring river. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed this, not just the words themselves, but the peace they brought. Night after night, the ritual continued. Matthew found himself looking forward to these evening prayers, though he stayed by the door, not quite ready to join them. But his heart listened, storing away each verse like kindling for some future warmth. One particularly bitter night, when the wind howled like a hungry wolf pack, Matthew woke to sounds of distress. Nora was thrashing in her sleep, murmuring words he couldn't catch. He crossed the cabin quickly, concern tightening his throat. "Nora," he said softly, touching her shoulder. "Wake up now. You're safe." Her eyes flew open, wild with remembered terror. "The flames," she gasped. "I couldn't reach them." "Ain't no flames here," Matthew assured her, his voice steady. "Just snow and more snow." Her hands shook as she pushed herself upright. Without thinking, Matthew caught them in his own, his rough palms gentle around her trembling fingers. In the dim light from the banked fire, he could see the scars that marked her skin, badges of courage from the fire that had taken her family. "I still see it sometimes," she whispered. "The fire that took James and our baby girl. I dream I'm running through burning rooms, but I never reach them in time." Matthew held her hands until the shaking eased. He understood such dreams, how the past could rise up in the dark hours, sharp as broken glass. "Ain't your fault," he said softly. "Some hurts take longer to heal than others." They sat in comfortable silence while the wind rattled the shutters. Eventually, Nora's breathing steadied. She drew her hands back slowly, but something had changed between them, a trust deeper than words. The following days settled into a rhythm of shared tasks and quiet moments. Matthew noticed how naturally they moved around each other in the cabin's close quarters. Nora darning socks by the fire while he cleaned his rifle. Both of them working together to teach Caleb his letters, using the Bible as their primer. One afternoon, as they sat mending mittens worn thin from chopping wood, Nora spoke of her life before the fire. "James was a carpenter," she said, her needle moving steadily through the wool. "He could make anything from wood, furniture fine as any store-bought piece. Our Rebecca was just starting to walk when—" Her voice caught, but she continued. She had his eyes, bright as morning. Matthew nodded, understanding her need to speak of them. "Sarah, my wife. She loved spring best," he offered in return. "Used to say the first crocus was God's promise kept new each year." He paused, surprised by how the memory brought more comfort than pain. "Been a long time since I spoke her name aloud." "Sometimes speaking them makes them feel closer," Nora said softly. "Like they're just in the next room, waiting, Caleb looked up from his own small attempts at mending. "I remember Mama singing," he said suddenly, "when she made bread." Matthew and Nora exchanged glances, both knowing the rarity of Caleb speaking about his mother. Nora reached out and squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with understanding. The winter days stretched long, marked by the slow burning of their precious lamp oil and the dwindling of their provisions. Yet even as they carefully rationed their beans and venison, sharing stories seemed to fill some deeper hunger. Matthew found himself watching Nora more often, the way she moved with quiet grace, how her hands were always busy with some task to make their shelter more of a home. The lamp flame caught golden glints in her hair as she bent over her mending or helped Caleb with his letters. Even on the coldest nights, she kept that lamp burning during prayers, as if its small light could push back more than just physical darkness. Matthew began to understand that faith wasn't just about the words in the good book. It lived in daily acts of kindness, in steady hands holding another's fear at bay, in the courage to begin again after loss. Spring still felt as distant as a dream, buried under feet of snow and bitter wind. But in their cabin, hope had taken root like a hardy mountain flower pushing through frost. It grew in the quiet moments between chores, in shared glances over Caleb's head as he sounded out Bible verses, in the way they all drew closer to the hearth each evening for prayers. One night, as Nora's voice carried the familiar words of Psalms through the cabin, Matthew finally moved from his place by the door. He settled on the edge of the bed beside Caleb, his presence an unspoken joining of their small circle. Nora's reading faltered for just a moment, then continued steady and clear, while Caleb leaned against his father's side. The lamp flame danced in its glass chimney, never quite dying despite the draught that crept under the door. Like that flame, something warm and bright burned between them now, not the destructive fire of their past losses, but the gentle light of new beginnings. Matthew watched his son's face in the lamplight, peaceful now as he listened to Nora read. The boy who had once been so withdrawn was slowly opening like a flower to the sun, nurtured by Nora's patient care. And Matthew realized his own heart was doing the same, turning toward her light with a hope he'd thought forever lost in grief's long winter. Together they endured the deep snow and meager meals, the long nights and howling storms. Yet each shared hardship seemed to bind them closer, like rough-hewn logs carefully fitted to make a strong wall against the cold. Their faith grew stronger too, not in spite of their trials, but because of them, each small victory over winter's bite, a testament to God's provision through one another. The lamp burned low each night, but never went out. Like the flame they tended so carefully, the warmth between them continued to grow, fed by shared prayers and gentle hands, by stories of those they'd lost and hope for what might yet be found. Winter's grip would eventually loosen, but the bonds forged in these quiet evening moments would endure, strong as cabin timbers, warm as a lamplight on beloved faces, deep as prayer itself. The first hints of spring whispered through the mountain valley like a secret. Patches of bare ground emerged from beneath the snow, dark and sodden. Tiny rivulets of meltwater trickled down the slopes, joining into larger streams that sang with the promise of warmer days ahead. Matthew stood on the cabin's porch, studying the changing landscape. His trained eye noted how the snow had settled and compacted, making the trail to Silver Creek passable again. They needed supplies, and his winter pelts would fetch good prices now. He shifted his weight, testing his leg after the long confinement of winter. Inside the cabin, Nora stirred a pot of morning porridge, while Caleb set out their tin plates. The domesticity of the scene tugged at Matthew's heart. These past months, Their small shelter had grown into something more than just a refuge from winter. It had become a home. "Thinking of heading to town," Matthew announced as he stepped back inside. "Snow's firm enough for the wagon now." Nora looked up from the pot, her face brightening. "I should come along. My herb supplies are running low, and I heard tell the mercantile got a shipment of medicinals in before the last storm." "Reckon that'd be fine," Matthew nodded, trying to hide his pleasure at her suggestion. "Caleb can mind things here for a spell." The boy's face fell slightly, but he straightened his shoulders. "I'll keep the fire going proper, Pa." They set out after breakfast, the wagon's wheels crunching through patches of crusty snow. Matthew had wrapped his pelts carefully in oilcloth, protecting the valuable furs from the melting snow. Beside him on the wagon seat, Nora sat wrapped in her shawl, her breath making small clouds in the crisp morning air. The ride to Silver Creek took longer than usual, with Matthew carefully picking their path around muddy spots where the thaw had softened the ground. They passed the time sharing comfortable silence, broken occasionally by observations about signs of spring, a hawk wheeling overhead, the first green shoots pushing through south-facing slopes. The settlement came into view around midday, its collection of wooden buildings huddled against the mountainside. More people than usual crowded the muddy street, drawn out by the milder weather. Matthew helped Nora down from the wagon, his hand lingering briefly on her waist. "I'll see to the pelts at Morrison's trading post," he said. "Meet you there after you visit the mercantile?" Nora nodded, adjusting her shawl. "Should not take long to find what I need." Matthew watched her make her way down the street, noticing how some townspeople still turned to stare at her passing. The sight made his jaw tighten, but Nora held her head high, ignoring the sideways glances. At the trading post, Matthew began the familiar ritual of negotiating prices for his furs. Mr. Morrison examined each pelt carefully, making appreciative sounds at the prime winter coat on a particularly large beaver skin. They were deep in discussion when the door burst open, bringing with it a blast of cold air and a stranger's harsh voice. "Where is she? Where's the murdering witch?" Matthew turned to see a man standing in the doorway, his face flushed with anger or whiskey, maybe both. He was well-dressed but disheveled, with the hard eyes of someone carrying old grievances. "Sir, I'll thank you to conduct your business quietly or take it elsewhere," Morrison said firmly. The stranger ignored him, his gaze fixing on something through the window. "There she is," he stormed back outside. Matthew's heart clenched as he followed the man's line of sight to where Nora was emerging from the mercantile, her basket full of purchased supplies. The stranger was already striding toward her, his voice rising to carry across the street. "Nora Thorne! Did you think you could hide forever in these mountains?" Nora froze, her face draining of color as she recognized the man. Her basket slipped from nerveless fingers, spilling herbs into the mud. Matthew was moving before he even made the conscious decision, shouldering his way past Morrison and out onto the street. A crowd was already gathering, drawn by the man's shouting. "Folks of Silver Creek," the stranger announced, playing to his growing audience. "Let me tell you about this woman. I'm Jedediah Thorne, and she married my brother James back in Kansas City. Then she burned our family home to the ground with James and their baby girl inside." Gasps and mutters rippled through the crowd. Matthew reached Nora's side, feeling her trembling. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. "That's right," Jedediah continued, his voice dripping with venom. "She killed my kin and ran, leaving nothing but ashes behind. And now I find her here, probably planning the same for some other poor fool who took her in." "You've said enough." Matthew's voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade through butter. He stepped between Nora and Jedediah, his stance wide and solid as a mountain pine. Jedediah's eyes narrowed. "Who might you be, friend?" "Matthew Hart, and I don't recall asking for your friendship." The words came out cold and hard as river ice. "Well, Mr. Hart, I'd step careful if I were you. That woman behind you is poison. I aim to see justice done. I'm taking this to Sheriff Dugan today." Jedediah's hand strayed toward his gun belt. Matthew didn't move, except to rest his own hand casually near his holster. "Make whatever claims you want to the law, but you're done shouting in the street." The two men locked eyes, tension crackling between them like static before a storm. Finally, Jedediah's mouth twisted in an ugly smile. "Have it your way, but mark my words, everyone will know what she is before I'm done." He turned on his heel and stalked away toward the sheriff's office. The crowd began to disperse, but Matthew could hear the whispers starting already, could see the sideways glances at Nora. He turned to find her staring after Jedediah, her face ash pale. "Let's get you home," he said quietly, gathering her spilled purchases. She moved like someone in a dream as he helped her into the wagon. The ride back was silent except for the creak of wheels and the occasional snort of the horses. Nora sat rigid beside him, her hands clenched in her lap. As they passed the burned remains of his old cabin, she finally spoke. "I thought the past was buried," she whispered, her voice catching. "I thought I'd run far enough." Matthew kept his eyes on the trail, but reached over to grip her hand. Her fingers were cold as ice despite the spring sunshine. "We'll face it together," he said firmly. "Whatever comes." Darkness was falling by the time they reached the cabin. Caleb ran out to meet them, but fell silent when he saw their faces. Matthew sent him inside to bank the fire while he helped Nora down. "You should know the truth," she said softly, not meeting his eyes, "before Jedediah tells his version to the whole town." "When you're ready," Matthew answered. "Not before." That night, after Caleb was asleep, Matthew sat by the door with his rifle across his knees. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, an owl called once, then fell silent. He watched Nora's restless turning in her bed, knowing sleep would be long in coming for both of them. The past had found them, riding in on the spring thaw like winter's last bitter storm. But Matthew meant what he'd said. They would face it together. He'd lost one family to death and another to fire. He wouldn't lose this one to a stranger's accusations, no matter what truth or lies lay buried in Nora's past. The fire crackled low in the hearth as Matthew kept his vigil, his rifle ready, watching the darkness beyond their door for whatever tomorrow might bring. The mountain morning dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on pine needles. Matthew stood at the cabin door, watching the sun paint the Kio, eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. He'd been up since before first light, unable to shake the unease that had settled over him since their encounter with Jedediah Thorne in town. Inside, he could hear Nora moving quietly around the cabin, careful not to wake Caleb as she started breakfast. The familiar sounds of coffee brewing and kindling catching in the stove should have been comforting. But Matthew's shoulders remained tense. His instincts, honed by years in the wilderness, told him trouble was riding their way. Those instincts proved right when he spotted a lone rider coming up the mountain trail, the morning sun glinting off a tin star. Sheriff Walter Dugan sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, though Matthew noticed the older man's slight grimace as he dismounted. "Morning, Hart," Dugan called out, leading his horse to the hitching post. "Figured we ought to have us a talk." Matthew nodded, staying where he was. "Coffee's hot if you're of a mind." "Appreciate that." The sheriff tied his reins and climbed the 3 rough-hewn steps to the cabin's small porch. His boots made hollow sounds on the wood planking. Inside, Nora looked up from the stove, her face carefully composed. "Sheriff," she said quietly, already reaching for another cup. Dugan touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." He settled into one of the wooden chairs at the table, while Matthew remained standing, leaning against the doorframe. The coffee made dark circles in their cups as Nora poured. Steam rose in the cool morning air, carrying the rich scent through the cabin. In his bed in the corner, Caleb stirred but didn't wake. "Reckon you know why I'm here," Dugan said finally, wrapping weathered hands around his cup. Matthew took a slow sip before answering. "Jedediah Thorne's been talking." "That he has." The sheriff's eyes moved to Nora, who stood very still by the stove. "Been telling some mighty troubling tales about fires and death back in Kansas City." "Tales being the right word," Matthew said evenly. Dugan sighed, looking older than his years. "Look here, Hart. You've been a good neighbor since you settled this claim. Keep to yourself, pay your taxes, never caused any fuss. But folks in town are starting to talk, and talk can turn ugly fast out here. Let them talk. It ain't that simple." The sheriff set his cup down with a soft click. "Your homestead claim ain't fully proved up yet. Still got another year before the land's yours proper. Folks won't stand for harboring trouble, and there's them that might challenge your right to stay." Matthew straightened, his voice cooling. "My claim's solid. I've worked this land honest, built 2 cabins now with my own hands. And I don't dispute that." Dugan held up a placating hand. "But you know as well as I do that homestead laws require good character. If enough respected citizens raise objections..." He let the threat hang unfinished in the air. The silence, stretched, broken only by the pop of burning wood in the stove, and Caleb's soft breathing. Nora had turned to face the wall, but Matthew could see her shoulders trembling slightly. "Sheriff," Matthew said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I've lived by God's law out here longer than most. He knows the truth of what happened back in Kansas City, and so do I. I'm not sending her away." Dugan studied him for a long moment, then pushed back his chair with a scrape of wood on wood. "That's your choice to make. But I'm telling you as a friend, this won't blow over easy. Thorne's got money and connections. He's already telegraphed back east for papers he claims will prove his accusations." "Then let him prove what he wants." Matthew moved to stand beside Nora, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "We'll face it square." The sheriff shook his head as he stood. "Your pa was just as stubborn, God rest him. I hope you know what you're doing, Hart." He settled his hat more firmly and headed for the door. At the threshold, he paused. "Ma'am," he said, not quite looking at Nora. "Whatever the truth is, I hope it was worth the price you're asking this man to pay." After he'd gone, the cabin seemed too quiet. Matthew watched through the window as the sheriff rode back down the trail, his figure growing smaller against the vast mountain landscape. Behind him, he heard Nora's shaky exhale. "He's right," she whispered. "I can't ask you to risk everything you've built here, your land, your home." Matthew turned to answer, but a soft sound from Caleb's bed showed the boy was finally stirring. The conversation would have to wait. The day passed in a strange tension. They went about their usual tasks, Matthew checking his trap lines, Nora tending her small herb garden, Caleb doing his lessons. But unspoken words hung heavy in the air. As evening approached, Matthew noticed Nora making subtle preparations, gathering her few belongings, rolling her spare clothes into a tight bundle. After supper, while Matthew was outside chopping wood for the night, Caleb's cry split the air. He rushed into the yard, tears streaming down his face. Pa, Nora's leaving!" Matthew dropped the axe and strode toward the cabin, his long legs eating up the distance. He found Nora in the doorway, her traveling bag clutched in one hand. Her face was pale but determined. "I won't bring trouble down on your heads," she said before he could speak. "You've rebuilt once already because of fire. I won't be the cause of you losing everything again." "Nora, please!" Caleb grabbed her skirts, his voice breaking. "Please don't go." She touched his head gently, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Sometimes leaving is the kindest thing we can do for those we—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "If you walk out that door," Matthew said quietly, "you'll burn me worse than that fire ever did." Nora's breath caught. She looked at him, really looked, and whatever she saw in his face made her hands begin to shake. The bag slipped from her fingers to thud softly in the dirt. "I couldn't bear it," she whispered. "If you lost your land because of me, if people turned against you, if Caleb had to face their scorn." "Then we'll face it together." Matthew stepped closer, close enough to see the tears trembling on her lashes. "We've already lost too much to fire and fear. I won't lose you too." A sob broke free from her throat. Caleb wrapped his arms around her waist as she covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Matthew enfolded them both in his embrace, holding his fragile family together as the last light faded from the sky. After a while, Nora's tears subsided. She wiped her eyes with trembling fingers and looked up at Matthew. "What do we do now?" Instead of answering directly, he took her hand and led her back inside the cabin. Caleb followed, still sniffling slightly. Matthew reached for the family Bible that sat on the shelf, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. "We pray," he said simply, and knelt on the rough wooden floor. Nora sank down beside him. Caleb pressed close between them. Outside, the evening wind sighed through the pines like a whispered blessing. Matthew's deep voice filled the cabin as he began to pray, asking for strength, for guidance, for protection against those who would tear them apart. As their quiet amens faded into the gathering darkness, Matthew felt a peace settle over him. Whatever Jedediah Thorne might bring against them, whatever the town might say or do, they would face it together. Here in this cabin, with the woman who had saved his son and the boy who had brought them all together, he was home. The wind continued its gentle song outside, carrying with it the promise of grace returned, not earned, but freely given, like the love that had brought healing to 3 wounded hearts on this remote mountain homestead. The mountain spring brought warmer days but colder welcomes in Silver Creek. Matthew noticed it first at Whitaker's general store, where his prime pelts, worth good coin any other season, drew only tight lips and averted eyes from the owner. "Ain't got need for furs right now," Whitaker mumbled, suddenly very interested in his ledger. "Maybe try Jensen's store up in Fairplay." Matthew's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Fairplay's 3 days' ride, Tom. You know these pelts are worth your time." "Times change." Whitaker wouldn't meet his eyes. "Folk got particular about who they do business with these days." The ring of the doorbell cut through the tense silence as another customer entered. Matthew gathered his pelts with deliberate care, each movement measured to contain the anger burning in his chest. "Reckon they do at that," he said quietly, and walked out. The scene repeated itself across town. The gunsmith had no ammunition to spare. The feed store was mysteriously short on grain, and the butcher's prices had doubled overnight. Only old widow Chen at the laundry treated him normally, accepting his coins with the same gentle smile as always. "Tea?" she offered, gesturing to the steaming pot on her counter. Matthew hesitated, then nodded gratefully. The familiar bitter warmth helped ease the knot in his shoulders. People fear what they don't understand, she said softly in her accented English. Give them time to see truth. He rode home with empty saddlebags and a heavy heart, wondering how long their dwindling supplies would last. The cabin came into view just as sunset painted the mountains gold. Smoke curled from the chimney, and he could hear Caleb's laugh mixing with Nora's voice, a sound that somehow made the day's burdens lighter. Inside, Nora stirred a pot of thin soup while Caleb practiced his letters. Their stores were getting low, the barrel of flour barely a quarter full, the salt pork nearly gone. But Nora had ways of stretching what they had, supplementing with early spring greens and the last of their preserved vegetables. How was town? She asked, though her eyes said she already knew. Same as you'd expect. Matthew hung his hat by the door. Might need to ride to Fairplay soon. Nora's hands stilled on the ladle. Because of me. Because some folks need time to remember their Christian charity, he corrected firmly. Caleb looked up from his slate. Tommy Miller's pa wouldn't let him play with me yesterday. Said we was trouble. Matthew's fists clenched, but Nora spoke first. Sometimes people say unkind things when they're scared or don't understand. We just have to show them there's nothing to fear. The next morning brought Mrs. Jensen from the neighboring ranch, riding hard with fear in her eyes. Her youngest had taken fever in the night. The doctor was 3 days away, and the child's breathing worried her. Nora didn't hesitate. She gathered her herbs and healing supplies, then turned to Matthew. I have to go. He nodded. Want company? Better not. Might make things harder. She touched his arm briefly. I'll be careful. Matthew watched her ride away, respect mingling with concern. Despite everything, she wouldn't turn away someone in need. It was one of the things he admired most about her. 3 days later, word spread that little Sarah Jensen had pulled through. The fever broke under Nora's care, her breathing eased by herbal steam and careful tending. Mrs. Jensen's quiet gratitude spoke volumes, even if her husband still looked away when they passed in town. More calls came after that, a ranch hand's infected cut, the miller's wife struggling with her first pregnancy, a shepherd boy's broken arm. Nora answered them all, earning whispered thanks from mothers and grudging appreciation from fathers. But the very skill that made her valuable also fed the resentment of others. Witch woman, some muttered, using fire magic to bind people to her. Matthew's patience wore thin, though he preached it daily to Caleb. We can't control what folks think, he explained one evening as they mended tack together. But we can control how we act. That's what matters to God. But it ain't fair, Caleb protested, his young face fierce. Nora helps everybody, even them that talk mean about her. Why can't they see she's good? Matthew squeezed his son's shoulder. Sometimes seeing takes time, son, and courage to admit being wrong. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. Matthew hitched the wagon, helping Nora and Caleb up onto the seat. They hadn't attended church since Jedediah's accusations, but Matthew had decided it was time to take a stand. The small wooden church sat proud against the mountain backdrop, its white paint gleaming in the morning sun. Folks gathered on the steps fell silent as Matthew's wagon approached. He helped Nora down, noting how she straightened her spine against the stairs. At the door, Preacher Crane hesitated, his usual welcome frozen on his lips. Matthew met his gaze steadily, then deliberately removed his hat and stepped inside. He led his family to an empty pew, laying his hat beside Nora in a clear gesture of protection and respect. The silence stretched taut as a fiddle string. Then old Mrs. Chen shuffled in and sat directly behind them. Widow Jensen followed with her children. Slowly, the church filled, though many chose pews far from the Hart family. Preacher Crane cleared his throat and opened his Bible. His voice gained strength as he read from 1 Corinthians. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It does not dishonor others, is not self-seeking. The familiar words fell like gentle rain on parched earth. When the first hymn began, Matthew's deep voice joined Nora's clear tone without hesitation. Caleb's small hand found hers as they sang, and gradually other voices swelled around them until the little church rang with praise. After the service, people filed past with varying degrees of acknowledgement. Some still hurried by with averted eyes, but others offered cautious nods. Mrs. Jensen stopped to thank Nora again for Sarah's care, speaking loudly enough for others to hear. The miller's wife touched her arm in passing, whispering that the baby was kicking strong now. Small victories, Matthew thought, watching Nora's face brighten with each tiny gesture of acceptance. Like spring thawing frozen ground, hearts could warm slowly but surely when given reason and time. They lingered on the church steps, Matthew exchanging quiet words with Preacher Crane while Caleb played marbles with the Chen grandchildren. Nora stood slightly apart, her scarred hands clasped before her, until Mrs. Miller approached hesitantly. "My Thomas has been coughing something fierce," she said, twisting her handkerchief. "I was wondering, that is, if you wouldn't mind." "Of course I'll come," Nora answered softly. "Tomorrow morning?" Mrs. Miller nodded gratefully and hurried away. Matthew came to stand, beside Nora, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Reckon that's what faith looks like," he murmured. "Small steps toward what's right, even when it ain't easy." Nora's eyes shone as she watched more children gradually drift over to join Caleb's game. "Like a mustard seed," she quoted softly, "growing slow but sure." Matthew smiled, feeling the warmth of the spring sun on his face. The mountain peaks stood eternal against the blue sky, unchanged by human fears or prejudices. Like those mountains, he thought, truth and love would endure if they just held fast to what they knew was right. The wagon ride home was lighter somehow, filled with Caleb's chatter about his new playmates and plans for next Sunday. Nora hummed hymns under her breath as she prepared their simple dinner. And when Matthew said grace that evening, his deep voice carried a note of hope that had been missing in recent weeks. Small victories indeed, he reflected, as he watched his family by lamplight. But sometimes the smallest seeds grew the strongest trees, given time and trust in God's greater plan. The mountain snow retreated like a slow tide, revealing patches of earth that had slumbered beneath winter's blanket. First around the tree trunks, then along south-facing slopes, until finally the valley floor emerged wet and ready for new life. The air carried the sharp scent of pine sap and melting frost, mingled with wood smoke from the cabin's chimney. Matthew Hart stood at the edge of what would become their pasture, studying the lay of the land. The morning sun warmed his shoulders as he drove another post into the softening ground. Nearby, Caleb wrestled with a length of rail fencing, his face screwed up in determination. "Here, son," Matthew called, moving to help. "Lift from your legs, not your back." Together they positioned the rail, Matthew showing his boy how to notch it properly against the post. The sound of boots crunching on thawing earth made them both look up. Nora approached carrying a bucket of water, her skirts gathered above her ankles to keep them from the mud. "Thought you might be thirsty," she said, offering the dipper first to Caleb, who drank eagerly. Matthew wiped his brow with his sleeve before taking his turn. "Much obliged." He gestured at their progress. "Reckon we'll have the south side done by sundown." Nora surveyed their work, shielding her eyes against the morning glare. "It's coming along fine," she said, and something in her tone made Matthew pause. There was a lightness there he hadn't heard before, like winter's weight had lifted from more than just the land. They worked steadily through the morning, the rhythm of their labor punctuated by the hollow thunk of the post-hole digger and the scrape of wood on wood. Caleb ranged back and forth, fetching tools and holding rails steady, proud to be trusted with real work. His earlier solemnness had begun to fade these past weeks, replaced by a boy's natural energy. Near midday, Nora brought out bread and cold venison, and they sat in the new grass to eat. The spring breeze carried the sound of meadowlarks from the valley below. Matthew noticed how the sun caught golden highlights in Nora's hair, usually hidden beneath her bonnet. She was humming softly as she cut thick slices of bread, an old hymn he recognized from Sunday services. "Sounds nice," he said before he could stop himself. A faint blush touched her cheeks, but she didn't stop humming. Instead, she smiled and passed him an extra slice of bread. Their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange, and Matthew felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sun. After the meal, they turned to the vegetable patch behind the cabin. The ground there had been turned weeks ago, as soon as the frost allowed. Now it waited, dark and rich, for planting. Nora had saved bean seeds from their winter stores, soaking them overnight to encourage sprouting. "Like this," she showed Caleb, demonstrating how to space the seeds and cover them properly. "Not too deep, or they'll struggle to reach the sun." Matthew watched them work together, noting how naturally they moved in tandem. Nora's patient instruction and Caleb's eager learning spoke of a trust that had grown as steady as the spring itself. His boy had taken to following her about like a shadow, helping with her herbs and listening to her stories of far-off places. The afternoon found them on the cabin roof, replacing shingles damaged by winter storms. Matthew worked methodically, showing Nora how to layer each piece to prevent leaks. She proved a quick study, her hands sure despite the height. "My father was a carpenter," she explained, nailing another shingle in place. "I used to help him sometimes, before—" She trailed off, but the old pain in her voice had softened to something more like remembrance than grief. "He taught you well," Matthew said simply, and was rewarded with another of those increasingly frequent smiles. Below them, Caleb practiced his letters in the dirt with a stick, sounding out words from memory. The boy had learned more from Nora's patient teachings than Matthew had managed in years of trying. Watching them together often stirred something in his chest, a feeling both warm and bittersweet, like seeing a forgotten dream made real. As the sun began its westward slide, they finished the roof repairs and climbed down. Matthew's muscles ached pleasantly from the day's work, but it was a good ache, the kind that spoke of progress and purpose. He built up the cook fire while Nora prepared their evening meal, moving easily around each other in the cabin's small space. The spring twilight stretched long and golden across the valley. After supper, Matthew brought out 2 cups of coffee and joined Nora on the porch steps. The evening air carried the sweet scent of wild plum blossoms from down by the creek, mixed with the sharp tang of pine. Caleb sat nearby in the grass, absently humming the fomba, same hymn Nora had sung earlier while he whittled at a piece of wood. The boy's face was peaceful in the fading light, focused on his small task with quiet contentment. Matthew cradled his coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep into his calloused hands. The moment felt somehow significant, like a page turning in a book. He found himself speaking almost without meaning to. "Been a long time since I felt this kind of peace," he said softly. "Not since before the fire, I reckon." Nora was quiet for a moment, watching the last sunlight gild the distant peaks. When she spoke, her voice held a gentle wisdom that made his heart ache. "Then maybe it took a fire to make room for it." The words hung in the evening air, simple but profound. Matthew turned to look at her, really look at her, and found her watching him with eyes that held no blame, no bitterness, only understanding born of shared pain and healing. Their hands met briefly over the coffee cup as she passed it back to him. And in that moment of contact, Matthew felt something shift and settle in his soul. The world seemed to hold its breath, then exhale slowly into the gathering dusk. Above them, the first stars began to appear, bright points of hope in the deepening blue. The valley spread out before them like a promise, reborn in spring's gentle touch. New grass covered the scars of last year's fire, and wildflowers had begun to bloom in the spaces between. Caleb's humming drifted up from where he sat, the hymn tune carrying clear and sweet in the evening stillness. Matthew recognized it now. Amazing Grace, the song of redemption and renewal. How fitting, he thought, for this moment of quiet revelation. The three of them sat there as twilight deepened, bound together by something stronger than circumstance or necessity. Each lost in their own thoughts, yet somehow more connected than words could express. The coffee cooled forgotten in their cups as the stars multiplied overhead, telling their ancient stories of persistence and return. A whippoorwill called from the forest edge, its plaintive song echoing off the hillside. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered, and then another. The familiar night music of the mountains rose around them like a blessing. Matthew felt Nora's shoulder brush against his as she shifted slightly, and neither of them moved away. The simple contact anchored him in the present moment, reminding him that sometimes peace comes not in the absence of pain, but in its transformation into something new and unexpectedly beautiful. The stars continued their stately dance across the darkening sky, witnesses to this quiet evening of healing and hope. Below in the valley, spring worked its ancient magic, turning winter's losses into summer's promises, one gentle day at a time. Dark clouds gathered over the Colorado mountains like a fist closing around the valley. Matthew Hart stood on his porch, watching the weather with practiced wariness. The air felt heavy, electric with the promise of rain, and his joints ached in the way that always preceded a strong storm. "Something's coming," he murmured, more to himself than to Nora, who stood beside him with her shawl pulled tight against the rising wind. She nodded, her eyes on the slate-gray sky. "The chickens have been restless all morning. Even the wrens have gone quiet." As if in answer, thunder rolled across the distant peaks. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering the dust with dark spots. Within minutes, the gentle patter became a steady drumming on the cabin's roof. "Caleb," Matthew called, "help me get the tools inside." His son appeared from around the corner of the cabin, already soaked to the skin. Together they began gathering the day's work implements, axes, saws, and the post-hole digger they'd been using to extend the garden fence. The rain intensified rapidly, becoming a gray curtain that obscured the valley below. Matthew felt the first stirrings of real concern when he heard the creek's voice change, becoming louder and more urgent. He'd lived in these mountains long enough to know how quickly weather could turn dangerous. "Nora," he said, raising his voice above the storm. "Start moving anything valuable up from the root cellar. Caleb, help her. I need to check the dam." The creek that ran below their property had been partially dammed the previous summer to create a small pond for fishing and irrigation. Now, with the sudden deluge, that dam could become a hazard if it didn't hold. Matthew pulled on his oilskin coat and headed down the slope, leaning into the wind. The path had already turned treacherous, mud sliding under his boots. Through the rain, he could see the creek had risen considerably, its usually clear water now brown with silt and debris. The dam was a simple structure of logs and stones, but it had served them well. Now it groaned under the pressure of the swollen creek, water spilling over its top in a dirty cascade. Matthew waded in, cursing at the cold, and began positioning additional rocks to reinforce the weakest points. Above the storm's roar, he heard hoofbeats. Sheriff Walter Dugan appeared through the rain like a ghost, his horse picking its way carefully down the muddy track. "Hart!" the sheriff shouted, reining in. "Silver Creek Bridge is gone. Water took it clean out. You'd best get your people to higher ground if this keeps up." Matthew's stomach tightened. The Silver Creek Bridge was solid oak construction, built to last. If it had failed. "Much obliged for the warning," he called back. The sheriff touched his hat brim and urged his horse onward, disappearing into the gray curtain of rain. Back at the cabin, Nora and Caleb had already moved most of their crucial supplies to the main floor. They worked efficiently, without panic, though Matthew could see the worry in both their faces. "Bridge is out in town," he told them, water running from his coat. "We need to be ready to move if it gets worse. Nora, can you pack some food and medicines? Caleb, help me get the mule hitched to the wagon, just in case." Thunder cracked overhead, so close it made the windows rattle. Caleb jumped, and Nora placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. The boy had grown braver these past months, but the storm's fury would have tested anyone's nerve. They worked through the afternoon as the storm intensified. The creek rose steadily, its roar becoming a constant background thunder. Matthew made several trips to check the dam, each time finding it holding but increasingly stressed. The rain showed no sign of letting up. As dusk approached, the wind rose to a howl, driving the rain sideways. Matthew called a halt to their preparations and gathered his family inside. The cabin's single room felt secure, but the weather's violence made the walls creak ominously. "We'll sleep dressed tonight," he announced, checking the oil level in their lantern. "Boots on, warm clothes ready. If that dam goes, we might need to move fast." Nora nodded, her face pale but composed. She had already packed their essential supplies in bags they could grab quickly. Caleb sat close to her, trying to look brave despite his obvious fear. Another thunderclap shook the ridge, and the lantern flame wavered. Nora reached for her Bible, the leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. When she began to pray aloud, her voice trembled slightly, but grew stronger with each word. "Lord, keep us safe through this storm," she said. "Guard this home as you have guarded us, and let your light shine through this darkness." Matthew found himself joining in with a quiet "Amen," surprising himself. Prayer had not come easily to him since losing his wife, but Nora's simple faith touched something deep within him. The night deepened, and the storm's fury seemed to grow with the darkness. Rain drummed against the windows with mechanical persistence. Every few minutes, lightning would transform the cabin into a place of stark shadows and harsh light. They tried to rest, but sleep proved elusive. Caleb dozed fitfully between them on his bedroll, while Matthew and Nora took turns watching the window that faced the creek. The water's roar had become so constant it seemed to fill the world. Shortly after midnight, the lantern began to sputter. The flame danced weakly, then died altogether, leaving them in storm-torn darkness. Matthew felt Nora's hand find his in the black, squeezing gently. He returned the pressure, drawing strength from the simple human contact. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the cabin in frozen moments like a series of paintings. Caleb's sleeping face, peaceful despite the chaos outside. Nora's profile turned toward the window, strong and determined. Their supplies stacked ready by the door, a testament to their preparation and hope. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very mountain. Matthew thought of that first night, months ago, when fire had brought them together. Now water threatened instead of flame, but the essence was the same. Nature testing their bonds, challenging their right to claim this piece of wilderness as home. They sat together in the darkness, listening to the storm's fury. Matthew felt an odd sense of completion, as if the circle that began with fire was being closed by this flood. Nora's hand remained in his, warm and real, anchoring him to the present moment. The rain continued its assault on the cabin roof, and the creek's voice rose and fell like distant surf. But within their shelter, something stronger than wood and nails held them together. A family forged in fire, tested by water, bound by choice rather than blood. Through the long hours, they waited for dawn, ready to face whatever the storm might bring. The darkness pressed against the windows, but it could not enter their circle of trust and shared courage. They had survived fire. They would endure this flood as well, together. The darkness before dawn brought no relief. The rain hammered harder, and Matthew jolted awake at a sound like distant thunder. But this wasn't thunder. It was the dam breaking. "Get up," he shouted, shaking Caleb awake. "Nora, the creek's burst." Through the window, he saw a wall of water churning down the valley, tearing trees from the banks. They had minutes, maybe less. Matthew snatched up Caleb while Nora, moving with desperate efficiency, grabbed blankets and threw them onto the mule's back. The roar grew louder. Matthew rushed outside, Caleb clutching his neck. The wagon stood ready on higher ground, but reaching it meant crossing the muddy slope. Nora followed, leading the mule, her face pale in the gray light. "Climb up!" Matthew lifted Caleb toward the wagon tongue. The boy's boots scraped against the wet wood, seeking purchase. Behind them, the flood crashed through their fence line, sweeping away posts like matchsticks. Then it happened. A surge of water hit the wagon, making it shudder. Caleb lost his grip and tumbled backward with a terrified cry. Before Matthew could move, the current swept the boy away into the churning darkness. "Caleb!" Matthew's scream tore from his throat, but Nora was already moving. Without hesitation, she dove into the flood after the boy. Matthew saw her dark head surface once, arms stroking powerfully against the current. Then both she and Caleb vanished in the muddy torrent. "No!" Matthew plunged in after them. The water hit him like ice, spinning him, filling his boots. He fought against the current, searching desperately for any sign of them. His lungs burned, branches and debris battered him as he swam. "Nora! Caleb!" His voice was lost in the flood's roar. The current dragged him under again and again until his strength began to fail. Each time he surfaced, he saw only muddy water and floating wreckage. Finally, exhaustion forced him toward the shore. His fingers found purchase on a half-submerged log, and he dragged himself onto the hillside. Gasping, shivering, he scanned the valley below. Nothing moved except the relentless water. The rain softened to a drizzle as dawn crept into the sky. Matthew collapsed on the hilltop, his clothes heavy with mud and water. The flood had taken everything: his family, his hope, his faith. Just like the fire had once taken his wife, now water had stolen his second chance at happiness. "Lord," he prayed hoarsely, his voice breaking, "don't take them too." But only the diminishing rain answered, pattering against the ruined valley below. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Matthew trudged through the mud, calling Nora's name until his voice grew hoarse. Neighbors from Silver Creek joined the search, forming lines to comb the creek banks and debris fields. Even those who had shunned them now waded through the muck, checking under fallen trees and behind rock outcrops. "Over here!" The shout came near midday. Matthew's heart leapt, but it wasn't Nora they'd found. It was Caleb, alive but shivering, clinging to a cottonwood branch nearly 2 miles downstream. The boy's eyes were wild with fear, his clothes torn to rags. "She pushed me up," Caleb whispered as Matthew wrapped him in a blanket. "Miss Nora pushed me to the branch, then the water took her." For 2 more days, Matthew searched without stopping. He refused food and barely slept, his boots wearing through from endless walking. The sheriff organized more search parties, but they found nothing. Some men spoke quietly of giving up, but Matthew pressed on, checking every bend in the creek, every tangle of flood debris. On the 3rd morning, bone-weary and hollow-eyed, Matthew found her shawl. The blue fabric was snagged on a root, muddy but unmistakable. His legs gave out, and he fell to his knees beside it. The tears he'd been holding back finally broke free, racking his body with grief. Preacher Crane found him there, still clutching the shawl. The older man's hand settled gently on Matthew's shoulder. "God's work isn't done when we can't see it," he said softly. "His mercy flows deeper than any flood." That evening, Matthew gathered driftwood from the creek banks. His hands, cracked and bleeding from days of searching, fashioned a cross. He planted it where the water had begun to recede, marking the spot where Nora's shawl had been found. As darkness fell, he sat beside the cross, a lantern casting weak light against the gathering shadows. Caleb lay curled against his side, finally sleeping after days of nightmares. Matthew stroked his son's hair, remembering how Nora had saved the boy twice now, first from fire, then from flood. The creek murmured below, its waters now calm and clear. Matthew watched the lantern's flame dance against the cross, his grief tempered by something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was faith, as fragile as the flickering light, but refusing to die out completely. The first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky when hoofbeats thundered up the muddy trail. Matthew looked up from where he knelt by the wooden cross, his eyes red-rimmed from another sleepless night. A rider from Silver Creek charged toward them, his horse lathered and breathing hard. "Hart! She's alive!" The man's voice cracked with excitement. "Found her downstream in Old Walker's fishing shack. She's breathing!" Matthew's heart seemed to stop, then surge back to life. He scooped up Caleb and raced to his horse, settling the boy in front of him. The morning mist swirled around them as they galloped through the valley, rainbow colors dancing in the spray where sunlight struck the fog. The abandoned log shanty sat tilted on its foundation, half buried in flood debris. 2 women from town stood guard at the door, armed with steaming coffee and blankets. Inside, Nora lay on a makeshift bed of hay, her dress muddy but her face peaceful. Her eyes fluttered open as Matthew dropped to his knees beside her. "Did the boy?" she whispered, her voice rough from creek water. "He's safe," Matthew choked out, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "You saved him again." Nora's fingers weakly squeezed his hand. Despite her pallor, a faint smile touched her lips. Matthew shrugged off his coat and wrapped it tenderly around her shoulders. With infinite care, he lifted her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. "The Lord gave you back," he murmured, over and over as he carried her outside. "The Lord gave you back to us." The sun had burned away the mist by the time they reached home. Caleb ran from the cabin, his face streaked with joyful tears. "Miss Nora!" he cried, reaching for her hand as Matthew carried her inside. She squeezed the boy's fingers weakly. "Couldn't leave, my family," she whispered. Matthew laid her gently on his bed, his own tears falling freely now. Through the window, morning light streamed across them all, a blessing bright as mercy. His faith, once shattered, now flooded back stronger than before, just like the woman who'd been returned to them through water and grace. 3 days after Nora's rescue, Matthew and several neighbors worked to clear the flood debris scattered across his land. The spring sun beat down as they hauled waterlogged timber and broken fence posts. Matthew paused to wipe his brow, leaning against a massive tangle of driftwood lodged against an old oak tree. Something caught his eye, a leather-bound book wedged in the branches. His heart skipped when he pulled it free. Though water-stained and swollen, he recognized it as a Bible, its pages warped but intact. Opening the cover carefully, his eyes widened at the inscription. "To my beloved Nora, Christmas 1875. Between the pages, he found a brittle envelope, the paper delicate from age and water. Inside was a letter, the ink faded but still readable. Matthew's hands trembled as he scanned the words written by Thomas Thorne, Nora's first husband, dated just days before the fatal fire. "Sheriff," Matthew called out. "Preacher Crane! Everyone, come quick!" The townspeople gathered as Matthew read the letter aloud, his voice carrying across the muddy yard. Thomas's words confessed his worry about the cheap lantern wick he'd purchased, fearing it might catch fire. The truth of that night, preserved in paper and providence, finally came to light. Nora stood on the porch, supported by 2 of the ranch wives, her face pale but peaceful as the letter cleared her name. Jedediah Thorne, who'd been helping with the cleanup, dropped his head in shame. Preacher Crane stepped forward through the silence, taking Nora's scarred hand in his. "No one walks through fire," he declared, his voice thick with emotion, "unless meant to bring light." The crowd murmured in agreement. The sheriff's wife wiped tears from her eyes. One by one, the townsfolk came forward to offer apologies and support. "We'll help rebuild the cabin," announced the mercantile owner. "Up on higher ground this time." "My sawmill will provide the lumber," added another neighbor. "And my boys will help with the raising," promised the rancher, who'd once turned away from her in town. Matthew watched as the community surrounded Nora, their harsh judgment transformed to acceptance by the truth God had preserved in water-soaked pages. She caught his eye across the yard and smiled, finally free of the burden she'd carried for so long. Weeks passed, and summer's warmth blessed the mountains. Golden sunlight spilled across the new cabin that stood proudly on higher ground, its fresh-cut timber gleaming above the verdant valley. The homestead buzzed with activity as townsfolk gathered to help raise the final roof beams. Matthew wiped sweat from his brow as he and the other men hoisted the heavy timbers. Sheriff Dugan steadied a ladder while Preacher Crane called directions from below. Women from town bustled about, preparing a feast on tables set beneath the pines. "Reminds me of barn raisings back east," Nora said softly to Matthew as she passed by with a pitcher of lemonade. Her eyes shone with joy, reflecting the changed hearts of the community that had once shunned her. When the last beam settled into place, cheers erupted across the homestead. The gathering transformed into a celebration as everyone shared a hearty supper of fried chicken, cornbread, and berry pies. Children played tag between the trees, while their elders swapped stories and laughter. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, the crowd gathered again. This time they formed a circle around Matthew and Nora, who stood beneath an arch of mountain pines. Caleb darted about the meadow, gathering wildflowers with careful attention. His small hands wove them into Nora's hair, each blossom a testament to new beginnings. Preacher Crane's voice carried across the hushed gathering as he spoke of love's redemptive power. Matthew's hands trembled slightly as he slipped a simple gold band onto Nora's finger. When they kissed, the assembled neighbors clapped and whistled, their joy echoing off the mountainsides. Evening settled over the land like a gentle blessing. Warm lamplight spilled from the cabin's windows, creating golden squares on the packed earth outside. Inside, the newlyweds moved about their tasks with comfortable familiarity. Nora sat at the table with Sarah Miller's youngest daughter, patiently helping her sound out words from a primer. The child's face lit up with each small victory. Nearby, Matthew worked quietly, his strong hands steady as he repaired the slat of a wooden chair. He paused occasionally to watch his wife and son, marvel at how naturally they had become a family. Caleb sat cross-legged by the hearth, carefully whittling a piece of pine while stealing glances at his new mother. Outside the cabin's door, Matthew had mounted a freshly carved wooden sign. The letters, cut deep and sure, proclaimed, "The Light Restored, Refuge for Travelers." Each stroke represented their journey from loss to love, from suspicion to acceptance. As stars began to pierce the darkening sky, the family gathered for evening prayers. Matthew's voice, once hesitant in matters of faith, now rang clear and confident. "Lord," he prayed, "you've turned our debt into devotion, our ruin into redemption. We thank you for the gift of each other, for neighbors turned friends, for grace that makes all things new." Nora's hand found his as they bowed their heads together. Caleb leaned against her other side, their shadows merging in the lamp's warm glow. The healer and the healed, finally at peace beneath heaven's wide mercy. Through the open window drifted the night sounds of the mountain, owl calls, cricket song, the distant rush of the creek. But within these walls, built by love and community, another sound prevailed. The quiet breathing of three hearts, finally, completely home. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.